Welcome to the Top 12 Highlights from Chapter 1. We're looking at Dr. Magleby's Constitutional Democracy. Let's start with number 1. What is a constitutional democracy? Well, Dr. Magleby starts by talking about it being government by representative politicians. These are people we elect to pass laws over us that then we have to follow. Part of the consent of the governed comes from that. It is constitutional, and that is there is a prescribed set of laws and powers that are available to the people. The people determine through free and fair elections who has that power and who holds on to it. It is fragmented in a pluralist society, so we have national, state, and local governments. We have the executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branches that then are fragmenting the power. They're all holding on to pieces of that power, and so elected officials have to work together. They have to compromise. They have to find and form coalitions in order to make things happen. Otherwise, nothing gets done. Now, is this realistic? Well, we see a lot of gridlock. We've seen a lot of gridlock. But realistically speaking, the founders and framers designed it this way so that it would be hard to pass legislation. It wouldn't be easy to get things through, but that was by design so that what did come through would be solid legislation that works for the American people, and it would stand the test of time. So what is the difference between a direct and representative democracy? Direct democracy would be where we vote on basically all legislation. We see this through referenda. When we vote for legislation on the ballot, referendum, vote for Initiative 6. That is direct democracy. We're voting on a particular law or particular piece of legislation that would then, for instance, in Maryland, would allow us to have casino gambling through slot machines. That was through referendum that actually happened. The state legislature put that to referendum for that purpose. A democracy, representative democracy, is when we elect leaders who then pass laws that then we have to follow. So there is a distinct difference here. We see a lot less direct democracy today because there's just too many people to possibly vote on everything. So a direct primary, though, is where we would nominate party candidates. You would have to be a member of the party unless it's an open primary. In Maryland, we have a closed primary, so you would have to be a member of the party in order to vote in that primary. But in a place like Ohio, New Hampshire, Indiana, they have open primaries where you can vote for whatever party you want to. You can't vote for both, but you have to go in and declare, I want a particular ballot. And actually, in Virginia has this as well. An initiative, as we just talked about, is a petition. It's part of direct democracy where people are voting on things. Placing those issues on the ballot is the referendum we're seeing here. Voters decide on what legislation is passed, whether that continues or not. And then recall is when you're removing an elected official, and the most recent of that probably being Gray Davis, was removed as California governor, and as a result of the electricity crisis. This would be, and it is commonly used in governorships, in gubernatorial races, to remove or to recall. We had Scott Walker actually in Wisconsin that was issued a recall, and he actually survived it. Then he would later lose re-election, but he did survive the recall. So it's an example of where one in California did succeed and in Wisconsin where it didn't. Let's talk about representative democracy for a second. So a participatory democracy is the idea that we have people participating at all levels and throughout government. They're influencing policymaking, they're writing letters to their officials, they're participating in rallies and interest groups, they're really making their voices heard to their legislators and really having an influence there. Broad participation. We love to see a participatory democracy. That's really what, by design, what our founders and framers wanted was for people to be involved. Not necessarily making all the decisions, but to be involved in their democracy and to learn more about it. And as they become more informed, to have more of a say as they are more informed and educated in making those decisions. A pluralist democracy is the idea we're competing. We have different parts of government, national, state, and local, executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch, that are basically competing with each other for policy influences. And then we have the elitist democracy, where we have small groups of people that have enormous power but make a lot of decisions that can really impact many people, both across the country, in particular states, and in particular areas of executive branch, for instance, education, as we talked about in class, that can impact students and student loans and student loan forgiveness programs. All of those are being made by people at the top that have significant decision-making power. Let's look at the forms of government. So we have an autocracy, and Magleby goes into more detail here in the Magleby text. Autocracy, we have one person in charge. An oligarchy, we have a few people. We see this in China, where it's a small group of people that are in charge. We have democracy, where the people choose. And then theocracy, like in Iran, where it's based on a religious form of government. All of these are forms of government that we see around the world. An absolute monarchy, someone who rules by king or queen. More common today, we see a constitutional monarchy. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is a constitutional monarchy. They have a crown, but it is more ceremonial in nature. They open Parliament, but Parliament is the one who makes the laws. Parliament with the Prime Minister decide whether those laws are put into effect and enforced or carried out. And then there's a totalitarian dictatorship, which is another form of government, going back to the autocracy model, very similar in that vein. So what values do we interact with when it comes to democracy? We all value the idea of liberty. We value freedom, kind of the big picture stuff. But how we go about carrying those things out is where we differ. And much of our political debate comes from those types of things. Well, equality of opportunity for all. Well, what does that mean? What does it look like? How is it shared? Popular sovereignty, the will of the people. How do we make sure that will of the people is carried out? How we go about doing these things is really where we see politics and policy today in government. So, the processes here, as part of that policy, then, are how we carry out the will of the people and that popular sovereignty, looking at how the democracy is shared among by and for the people. We have free and fair elections, where people elect their leaders, who then pass laws over them that they will then have to follow. We have a majority of that ruling in terms of what's carried out there. And free expression to be able to do so, to be able to seek redress of grievances, to share those grievances and have the freedom of speech to be able to do so, to be able to assemble in protest and to form petitions and initiatives to address government and try and seek what is wrong with government and trying to get legislation and policy changed in order to correct the ills of those struggles. We have a number of structures that are in place to help carry out this idea of democracy, the will of the people, the structures of government in a pluralist, elitist, bureaucratic system. We have federalism, the sharing of power, which we'll talk more about in a lot more detail in Chapter 3. We have a separation of powers that we looked at in terms of separate responsibilities and roles that each branch of government carries out. And we'll take a closer look at them in the Constitution in Chapter 2. We have a bicameral legislature, a result of the Virginia and New Jersey plans, the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, that looks at a House based on population in representation and an upper house, a Senate that is maintaining an equitable approach by state, not by size, not by population, but by equality of the states, so that each one is represented equally. We have checks and balances of those separate powers that basically keep power in check for the different roles and responsibilities that each branch carries out. And then a Bill of Rights to enshrine in our Constitution where government is limited, where the federal government, the national government, is limited in scope to protect the rights of the people. And we'll talk about this a little more, not to spell out what rights the people have, but to spell out where the government is limited in the powers it can take from its people, and very limited in that nature. And it was by design to do that. The Anti-Federalists and the Federalists seeing that through the Anti-Federalists seeing that through a Bill of Rights. The Federalists seeing that is enshrining that Bill of Rights to limit government's power in order to protect the will of the people. Now, all of these concepts and all of these ideas weren't just Madison's and Jefferson's alone. They were coming up with these ideas through the philosophers and what we were reading about, through John Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu, coming about from these natural rights theory, meaning that the life, liberty, and property, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, if you will, is not carried out in just by government, but by a higher authority, by a higher law, given by a supernatural power. And those are inalienable rights. They cannot be taken away. The ideals behind the unalienable rights were to protect individuals from the government and to limit the government's power over the people. And by doing that, the idea was the Constitution, ultimately with what Madison would write, would basically limit the national government's power. Ultimately, through selective incorporation, we'll see that it was more than just that. It was also the states that would be limited in nature as well. But where do all these ideas come from? Where does this idea of unalienable rights, the rights of life, liberty, and property, this contract, if you will, where does it all come from? Well, let's start with Hobbes. The idea behind this was Hobbes is writing in the late 1500s, early 1600s that the idea here is that man is pretty nasty, that it's a time of barbaric consequences, and the difficulties that people have in just trying to survive are hard enough. And so we really need government in order to maintain order, really to achieve some type of peace. And so there needs to be a contract between people and government in order to protect those types of rights. Now, Locke would come along and try and enshrine the idea of a social contract in order to address this, trying to look at the needs of what people have and say, hey, we're not giving up our power, we're basically providing government to protect those rights, to protect that power. And if that means that we have government in a way that can help us do that, then that's going to be more beneficial in having government there than having no government at all, that going back to the days of Hobbes. So the social contract theory really coming from Locke in trying to address that and saying, hey, let's have a contract with government by the people that can address those natural rights and enshrine them in some type of governing document. Montesquieu would go on to take it a step further to say, not only do we need government in this capacity, but let's find a way to separate those powers so that government can be checked, so that government can't become too powerful, because otherwise that defeats the purpose of why we have government there, to maintain order and to provide the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that we're all looking for. So that's really important. Separation of powers, the idea of checks and balances, is going to come from the concepts espoused by Montesquieu in this era in order to keep government in check and to keep government from becoming more powerful than it should, so that the power really is in the hands of the people. And then we have Rousseau. The idea of Rousseau is really to try and address the idea of the social contract. And, well, what happens if government doesn't live up to its end of the bargain? Well, Rousseau says, well, if we have a social contract and government isn't doing what it needs to, then we should be able to break that contract. We should be able to break that off. And this is really sowing the seeds of revolution that we look to here. Not just our revolution, the American Revolution, but the French Revolution in particular would be this model. And other revolutions along the way would look at the writings of Rousseau in really trying to address the needs of the people, in trying to keep the people's power and making sure that government is limited in that nature. And that's really an important point. That the Constitution that is written, the Bill of Rights that is written, it is all designed to give government certain powers and limit those powers by nature, and so all of the powers that are given to them by the people, and they can easily be taken away. And so Rousseau is saying that contract can be broken. Those rights and powers that we're giving to government can also be taken away if government oversteps its bounds, and never more do we see the need, and Jefferson and Madison saw the need, than in Shays' Rebellion. The idea of being able to put down a rebellion by a central government was next to next to nothing when it came to the Articles of Confederation. You have a central government with no power, no ability to tax, no ability to pay an army. You can collect one, but you certainly can't pay for one. And it really addressed the need for a stronger central government, which is what led to the Constitutional Convention. Now, the popular myth is, Constitutional Convention, you're going to create a constitution. That wasn't by design. That wasn't what they were intending to go there for. They were intending to go there to fix the Articles of Confederation. What they found when they basically started peeling back the onion was that the Confederacy model that they were looking at, the Confederation model, was really too weak. And it wasn't going to work. They were going to have to scrap the Articles and come up with a new form of government that gave stronger central government powers, but checked those powers through pluralism, through the elite theory, through the bureaucratic forms of government, and through the will of the people. We had states that would basically check those powers through the amendment process of the Constitution. We had a pluralistic government that would check those powers by keeping different branches and different levels of government in check through the national, state, and local governments and through those departments we talked about. So the compromises that came out of the Constitution were really focused on we have large states versus small states. We have the Virginia plan versus the New Jersey plan, slave states versus non-slave states, and there's a lot of compromise going on behind the scenes. Madison is really trying to work this out. And then we have the anti-federalists, the George Masons and Patrick Henrys of the world, that are really focused on how do we sign up for this when you're basically not outlining the rights that people have and limiting the government's power? Okay, that's all well and good, but we need to enshrine in this Constitution the individual rights that people have, and that ultimately would become the Bill of Rights that we know today. But the idea of this compromise would lead to a Senate that would be chosen by state legislatures, a president that would be chosen by electoral college, a judiciary that would be chosen, at least on the national level, by a president that was selected by an electoral college of essentially the electors, many of which were state legislators, and the real arduous task of trying to get legislation through this bicameral legislature and signed by a president would really be a difficult process, and it was by design. So all of these are really focused on limiting the power of government and enshrining the powers of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the hands of the people where it belonged. And so that if the people didn't like it, to Rousseau's point, they could reject their government, they could throw them out, and they could elect a new government with leaders that would be more akin to what the people wanted and what the people were looking for. So Madison had a lot of problems, though. He was trying to give the government enough power to be able to maintain a central government and an army to put down a rebellion like Shays' Rebellion, but not too much power that it violated rights. And so you saw Hamilton, Madison, John Jay would team up to write the Federalist Papers in order to try and find writings that they would craft that would support ratification of this Constitution and really try and address the concerns that many anti-federalists or many people on the fence had about this new U.S. Constitution. What were some of the main concerns they had? Again, the central government was too strong. They were worried about the rights being taken away. They were worried that Congress would try and either tax people too much or take away commerce or put too much parameters on Congress. The president would become the commander-in-chief, but would also be this head of an army that would then usurp the will of the people. And the issue there was of great concern. They didn't want another King George, but this is starting to sound like one. And so they wanted to make sure there were checks and balances in place to limit those powers. And we'll see in the checks and balances that that's exactly what would, by design, it be created to do. Okay. The Anti-Federalists really wanted that Bill of Rights. As we know, they wanted to call for another constitutional convention to address those rights. Madison stepped back and said, hey, I'll work with you on this Bill of Rights, ultimately proposing 12 amendments, 10 of which would be ratified right away. One would be ratified hundreds of years later. But they would see a compromise. Patrick Henry, George Mason, James Madison would see compromise in pursuing a Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that we would come back to today. Now, some specific, in those Bill of Rights, we have some specific rights that are outlined as the will of the people. And these are important today. We see some more than others, but even during the Civil War, writ of habeas corpus was suspended during rebellion. But writ of habeas corpus, the idea that I need to know what I'm being charged with when I'm accused and arrested for a crime. Bill of attainder, certain groups of people being charged and with crimes, that would not be something Congress could pass. Or after the fact laws, ex post facto laws, could not be something Congress could pass. And a trial by jury, very important, that you would be tried by a jury of your peers, that there would be no excessive bail, that you would have privileges and immunities as you passed from one state to another, or you got married and moved from one state to another. There was no religious test for office, would be an important point that we would try and address there. And any types of laws or contracts or agreements that you signed in one state would be protected and honored in others. All of these trying to be spelled out in the Bill of Rights as additional individual freedoms that the people couldn't take away. So that's it for Chapter 1. I hope you found this helpful, and we will see you once again in Chapter 2. Good luck on the upcoming quiz and or test.